Welcome to the GOTO podcast. Each episode covers the brightest and boldest ideas from the world's leading experts in software development. Tune in for practical lessons, compelling theories, and plenty of inspiration. GOTO gathers the brightest minds in the software community to help developers tackle projects today, plan for tomorrow, and create a better future. Stay up to date with the latest in tech through GOTO's top-rated events in cities like Amsterdam, London, Copenhagen, and Chicago, and by subscribing to the GOTO Conference's YouTube channel, where you can find thousands more high-quality dev talks. Learn more at gotopia.tech.
Hello and welcome to this new mini-series for GOTO called The State of the Art. This series will explore generative AI, but also other emerging trends in things like platform engineering, new practices, new programming languages, and in this particular episode, sovereign cloud. I'm Charles Humble. I have 30 years experience as a programmer, an architect, and a CTO, and I'm currently working mainly as a freelance consultant and podcaster. I'm joined today by Jake Werner. Jake is co-founder and CEO of Cycle. Jake has nearly 2 decades working in data centers, infrastructure automation, and DevOps, from contributing to early OpenStack projects to leading development and one of the first bare metal infrastructure as a service providers. His background is rooted in solving complex infrastructure challenges. Jake, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Charles. Happy to be here.
It's lovely to have you on. So let's start at the top. What is Cycle and what problem are you trying to solve in the infrastructure space?
Yeah, so Cycle Cycle originally started as a alternative to Kubernetes. It was just mainly focused on how do we allow companies to take containers, be able to piece them together, Kubernetes, but without all of the extra complexity that typically comes with Kubernetes. Now, over time, Cycle has continued to Cycle has continued to grow. Now you can run, virtual machines, functions, etc., on top of the platform. But from a high level, it's a distributed control plane that allows companies to bring their own infrastructure, bring their own storage, bring their own compute, etc., own all of that, and then be able to run containers, virtual machines, with ease.
Okay, so pulling on that a bit more then, if Cycle started as an alternative to Kubernetes, what were the kind of limitations of Kubernetes that pushed you to build something different?
Yeah, so this kind of goes back to maybe my OpenStack days. So I was involved with OpenStack when OpenStack went from no one really knew what it was to everyone wanted to use it to where it became so complex that people kind of didn't want to touch it anymore. And so with Google releasing Kubernetes about a decade ago, I was kind of taking this long-term bet that we would see the same thing happen eventually, where companies would adopt Kubernetes. They would, again, we all know developers. They love to test things. They like to change, all the switches and levers. They enjoy breaking things, putting them back together, etc. I completely get it. And so the bet there was that organizations would adopt Kubernetes because it was, the next great hot thing. But then at some point, these same organizations would kind of take a step back and say, is this really what we should be spending our time managing? Is this what we wanted to really focus as one of our core competencies, or should we spend more time building our products, etc.? And so Cycle was built kind of in that vein of how do you allow companies to still have the same ownership and control that they would typically get with Kubernetes, again, meaning that they own their infrastructure, their networks, etc., but still have a platform experience on top of that infrastructure. So, I guess we can kind of, I know Heroku's not kind of the, it doesn't have the appeal that it once does, but if we wanted to kind of overly generalize, you can think of Cycle as Heroku, but on your own infrastructure. Right.
And that's, I think, one of the very interesting, it's one of the things that I found really interesting about Cycle is that it kind of goes beyond containers, right? So you're supporting VMs, but you're also supporting bare metal and functions as a service and so on. So can you maybe talk a bit about what the philosophy behind that broader approach is?
Yeah. So when we started building out the platform, it was, originally our goal was to build a containers as a service platform. So where we owned all the infrastructure, there's a number of other companies that are doing this now, but you can also think of, products like ECS, right? So originally our goal was to own all of the infrastructure, make it super easy. And then companies would just pay us per minute of runtime for these containers. But as we started building the product, this is many years ago at this point. As we started building the product, we started hearing back from larger organizations that were talking about a couple things. Number one is they were interested in a platform that would allow them to keep things simple, but have a higher ceiling, right? It is very common that a company that adopts a platform adopts a ceiling, and once they hit that ceiling, they have to then re-platform onto something that allows more control, right? And so companies we had a lot of feedback for companies saying like, hey, we want something that is simple, but it's really important that we are also adopting something that we're not going to grow out of a year from now. And so through all that feedback that we got, that's when Cycle that's when we kind of went back to the drawing board for Cycle and decided that we wanted to change the structure of how we were building the platform so that, again, companies could own their infrastructure. That was one of the big common asks was if we want to be able to have a high ceiling in terms of adopting this platform, we need to know that we can choose our providers, we can choose our infrastructure types, we can customize that infrastructure accordingly. And so that's kind of how that all came together, was being able to have a high ceiling and but still not have to sacrifice like simplicity, in that effort.
It's so interesting that, because I think that's a trade-off that we just see playing out over and over and again in the industry and in different places in different ways. So, a lot of my professional programming was in Java, and there was a period of time when Ruby on Rails was coming out. Ruby on Rails was like deeply fashionable for a period of time. And one of the reasons it was deeply fashionable was because it was incredibly easy to get a CRUD web app up and running really, really fast. It was fantastic for that. But then at some point you find something that you couldn't get Rails to do. And then you were, sort of banging against the edges of what was physically possible, I think, with the framework. And it's kind of, you alluded to Heroku, and it's kind of the same thing we saw playing out with Heroku and the sort of whole platform engineering space more broadly. There's this kind of push and pull between having something that is architecturally flexible enough whilst also still being easy enough to use. And it's just a really hard line to tread. I think it's a really difficult thing to get right.
Oh, absolutely. And it's one of the kind of sayings, or maybe not sayings, but one of the things that we talk about internally within the team and within our community and our ecosystem is just in terms of that ceiling, like you could build Cycle on top of Cycle, right? Like to show you how powerful the platform is. And that was like one of the big things, like originally, so a lot of people don't know this, but Cycle originally started out as like a Squarespace competitor. Like it was all about building websites. Before we were even talking about containers, it was just, about building websites. But I think even in the early days of Cycle, I knew that I wanted to build a platform that could run anything. Like, yeah, it was nice working with e-commerce companies, building websites, but I wanted to be able to allow companies to build their own platforms on top of Cycle. And so that's why for a while, one of our taglines that we were testing was the platform for building platforms, right? Implying that like Cycle's not really built for companies that are wanting to just throw one or two containers up, and host those anywhere. I mean, there's a number of places to do that. But Cycle is built more for companies that are saying, hey, I have 24 different microservices that need to talk to each other. I have different hardware and infrastructure requirements for different parts of my platform. And so we really wanted to make sure that the platform was positioned for those sorts of organizations where there is some level of complexity inherent in the application, or say in the project that these teams might be building. And so it's one of those things, like we've had companies move from Heroku to Cycle. We've had companies move from Netlify to Cycle. We've had companies move from Vercel over to Cycle. But we haven't seen it go the opposite way. And I think that is exactly, what we all have experienced back in the not early days, but over the number of years with Heroku, you always heard about companies kind of reaching that ceiling and needing to re-platform at that point. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, the kind of big news story here, and the reason that I wanted to get you on, is the announcement of a European control plane. And this is super exciting to me because something that I am having a lot of conversations, kind of off-the-record conversations with people, either as a journalist or through my consulting work, is a sense that Europe is overly dependent on US technology companies for its software IT infrastructure. And I've just really want to get into this conversation because I think it's really interesting. And one of the things that's really hard about getting into this conversation is it's really hard to find people who are willing and or able to talk about what they're thinking and doing on the public record, which is why this is so exciting for me. So you have announced a European control plane. I want to get into what that actually means. But before we do, could you maybe start by telling us a bit about why you're doing that? What prompted that move?
Yeah. So, well, first I wanted to kind of like dive into our use of the terminology around control plane. Because for a long time, we didn't really use that terminology with Cycle, but over the last few months, it kind of started making a lot more sense. So originally we called Cycle a platform, right? But I think everyone started using the term platform. So platform kind of lost a lot of its meaning because there's a platform for everything. And then at the same time, we started, we started like thinking about like what other words are there that describe what we do, and control plane, kind of bubbled up to be the best word to describe that, just in the context of we don't own our customer infrastructure, but it connects back to the control plane. So, like if you think about it, kind of as a decentralized orchestrator, that control plane, it kind of makes sense there. But to then dive into your question, so for since Cycle started bringing in customers back in 2019, our control plane has been just a North America control plane. So we've had infrastructure all around the US and Canada. Even though our control plane was spread across the United States and Canada, that didn't prevent our customers from being able to deploy wherever they wanted to, right? We've had a number of companies over in Europe for a number of years now. But so again, the control plane is just like where telemetry, commands, orchestration, those sorts of things happen, right? All applications, all customer data sits on their infrastructure. So that control plane did not actually prevent customers from deploying over in Europe. But with all the geopolitical things that have really kind of started to happen over the last, I guess probably a year and a half, although some would argue they probably started way before then. But I think in the last year and a half, especially in the last 5 or 6 months, with kind of the whole fiasco around Greenland, that it became a lot more real for a lot of people. And so that's where we started having companies that were already customers of Cycle saying, hey, like, I know that I own my infrastructure, but there's a business risk to even my telemetry data going back to the United States right now. And that is something that like I can deal with it, but I'd like not to. And so, the first couple of times this came up, it was kind of like, like that makes sense, but like it wasn't super critical. But when enough of our European companies started reaching out to us saying like, hey, how can we segment this so that we are entirely outside of the United States, that's when the decision was made on our part to to go and spin up another copy of Cycle, specifically to run only on European infrastructure. And so this way there's full segment, it's fully segmented between North America and Europe. And so while there's a number of benefits of doing that for like data sovereignty, and I'm sure we'll dive into those in a minute, there's also other benefits around performance and things like that. So yeah, it was something that we had a number of companies asking for, and we're thrilled that it's now live.
Yeah, no, it's incredibly exciting. It's interesting to me. So do you see this as because you obviously the context, you mentioned the geopolitics, right? So the context of this is the geopolitics, particularly in the US. So do you see this as a kind of a short-term reaction to that? Or do you think this is the beginning of what may end up being a sort of deeper, long-term change in how organizations in Europe think about their infrastructure?
I think that we're going to see it in waves, right? So I think like we just saw a short-term, very intense wave, and then it kind of died down as the conversation on Greenland, kind of paused. But I'm sure as time goes on, there's going to be a number of other events that are going to just kind of keep bringing the attention back to it, which is going to drive long-term change, right? So it's people reacting to news, kind of taking a breather. Something else happens, people take a breather. But over a long enough time, more and more, companies, whether it's, on the US side or on the European side or wherever they may be geographically, these companies are going to, I think data sovereignty is a good thing for everyone to have. I mean, that's like, I know we're talking about the EU control plane, but if we go back to the previous conversation about what we built in 2019, it was kind of the same idea, right? With allowing customers to own their infrastructure. Like we've always thought that people owning everything should be like, is kind of one of our core tenets. And so being able to allow people to have even more control over, where their, even telemetry data and things like that are going kind of resonates from that perspective too. So yeah, I think it's kind of short-term waves that are going to create long-term movement.
Right. Yeah. So Cycle is still a US founded company. So how do you build trust with customers who are explicitly trying to reduce their exposure to US influence?
Yeah, so Cycle is still a U.S. company. We're headquartered in Nevada, but with all the things that were happening kind of, geopolitically, like the writing was on the wall. And so late last year, my co-founder and I, we moved to Iceland. So a lot of that was for personal reasons. My wife and I had honeymooned here and, really enjoyed the country. So back when we had started dating many, many years ago, she told me that someday she would love to live internationally. So that was one of the kind of ideas there, but it did align with a lot of what we were seeing from the business of so many of the new companies that were reaching out to us were companies from Europe that were trying to get off of US owned hyperscalers. And so it kind of aligned there. So I think that just being here has kind of helped show European companies that we're serious about what we're doing. And then at the same time, I know I've kind of already poked at it before, but the big component of Cycle is that our customers own all their infrastructure, all their networks, etc. So they still get to fully own everything. And then with with what's going back to the control plane, it's mainly telemetry data. So the overall risk that I guess I'm talking about from versus the US Cloud Act is already relatively low because we don't have access to any of that customer data. But I think launching the EU control plane, physically now having residency in Iceland, I think are moves that show a number of European companies that it's more than just talk.
Right. Yes. Yeah. So you talked earlier about the control plane being fully segmented. So at a technical level, what does that actually mean? What are you doing differently from a typical cloud provider?
Yeah, so I don't know if it's different from a typical cloud provider, but so I guess number one, we haven't talked about it. Yeah, but with Cycle, whenever we have a control plane for a region, the control plane is spread across multiple providers. So it's not like we're just sitting on top of AWS or GCP or things like that. We are sitting across many different providers. Now, the EU control plane is only sitting on top of European infrastructure providers, so that way they're not subject to the US Cloud Act. Now, again, given that Cycle is technically still a U.S. company, I guess Cycle would be subject to it. But again, since we don't own any of that data, we don't have access to any of that data, it'd be kind of moot for the U.S. government to come after it. But to answer your question, there's no overlap between them. There's no data layers. There's no network communication between the control planes. They are fully separate and standalone. So, I know we're talking a lot about data sovereignty, but the other kind of benefit here is, and we've already had companies that are reaching out to talk about this is a company that, is big enough that they're using Cycle to build a complex offering, and they might be so sensitive to downtime that even though they get to own the infrastructure, et cetera, they can also now deploy across both control planes. So that way they're even hedging against if Cycle were to have an outage. Now, Cycle has not had an outage since I think like March 2021, and we put a lot of effort and a thought behind how do we make Cycle as resilient as possible, but when you have two fully independent control planes, if you were to deploy across both of those concurrently, if both of those go down at the same time, we as a society have a bigger issue. This is kind of my point there.
Right. Yes. Yeah. I'm wondering as well, so there's been this sort of rumbling cloud repatriation story for about 3 or 4 years. And it's one of those things, I'm not honestly sure how big it really is. But there are definitely cases of companies. I mean, Hay is a very famous example, but there are others. Dropbox was another. There are examples of companies that are bringing workloads back onto their own infrastructure, onto infrastructure that companies control from public cloud. So does Cycle kind of fit into that trend in some way as well, would you say?
Oh, absolutely. I would almost say that that's kind of a bigger trend than what we're seeing with some of the data sovereignty stuff. I mean, but again, we're trying to make everyone happy. So, the data sovereignty with the EU control plane, that makes people happy. But at the same time, I wouldn't say that it's one or the other, because we've had some companies that are as part of. So let me take a step back and provide a little bit more context. So some of the companies that have been reaching out to Cycle due to data sovereignty issues have told us hey, we can't just physically be on infrastructure here in Europe. We need to be on infrastructure owned by European providers, right? So for example, we had a company that has been using AWS for 16 years, and they came to us and said, hey, we're entirely on AWS infrastructure that is physically in Europe. But that's no longer good enough for us. We need to be out of AWS entirely. And we've had other companies say the same thing about Azure and GCP. And so we're seeing this pretty big move away from the hyperscalers. But these companies, while they're making these moves, are also starting to reevaluate, like, well, if I have to move off of this infrastructure anyway, like, why not, evaluate other options? And so since November of last year, so it's May right now. And yeah, so since November of last year, I would say, I don't have an exact number, but I would say 70% plus of the companies that have adopted Cycle have had a bare metal component. Now, whether that is bare metal that is sitting, in a facility that they own, or that is bare metal through like a neo cloud provider or a colo provider or something like that. But we've had a huge number of companies that are using this as a way of adopting, or using Cycle as a way of adopting bare metal, and seeing some pretty significant cost savings in the process. So recently we had a company, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to mention if I'm able to mention their name, but they are in the advertising space. And they were they were using AWS before. I believe their compute spend at AWS was somewhere around $45,000 a month. And by moving over to bare metal, their spend now is hovering around $12,000 a month. So they were able to see some pretty significant savings while also still taking on double the workloads that they previously were.
Right. What are the trade-offs that you're making? So if you decide to move away from AWS or GCP or Azure or something, what would you say are the trade-offs that you're making there? What do you lose if you abandon the cloud effectively?
Obviously, I'm biased, so, but I don't know if there's much that you would lose. And the reason I say that is we have companies that did, or that were previously on AWS, and some of them are still on AWS, but they're using Cycle to orchestrate on top of AWS. So they're still able to use other managed services through AWS. Like, we have a number of people using, Aurora DB and RDS and things like that. And so they're able to still use those, or, companies that are still using like, Google Cloud SQL, et cetera. So Cycle doesn't limit people from using those different technologies and services. Our goal is just to take raw compute and orchestrate on top of that. So our goal is that by adopting Cycle, you shouldn't ever have to be in a position where you feel like you're giving up something.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I would say there's, it depends what kind of company it is. Running your own data centers, if you haven't done that for a while, isn't necessarily that straightforward, right? There's ongoing capacity planning. If you've not had to do that before, if you've not done it for some time, that can actually be, I would say, surprisingly fraught. Those of us that have been around a long time will remember having very long procurement cycles for hardware that we had to work around, and, buying a server and racking it and installing all the necessary software is less trivial than you might imagine. And I think managing a data center for the long term is not necessarily a trivial thing.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So if the context is, if someone is moving from AWS to exclusively bare metal, what are they, gaining or losing at that point? Yeah, you're absolutely correct. Like, there are other stresses that come with if you are owning the bare metal yourself. But in the general context of Cycle being multi-cloud, multi-provider, et cetera, that's where I get a little bit more flexible with my answer. But yes, you're absolutely correct. If you're wanting to provision a rack or bare metal, and you own 100% of that bare metal yourself, yes, there's absolutely a number of things that now you have to manage that you don't. And so most of our customers today, not all, but most of our customers are acquiring bare metal through bare metal as a service providers. So they don't have to worry about too much of the procurement or networking, things like that. They're just getting access to the direct machines. Right.
Yes. Yeah. Tell me about so when we were speaking off mic before we started recording, you mentioned that you were partnering with Cherry servers. Can you talk about that? How is that ecosystem kind of important for delivering your vision of what you're trying to do?
Yeah. So as part of launching the EU control plane, and with the context of the US Cloud Act, it was important for us to build that EU control plane on infrastructure providers that were owned by European companies. And so Cherry Servers was one of the first companies that we started talking to. Their offering was incredible, especially their bare metal. I mean, it's wildly good for the price. And so, yes, so Cherry is one of the companies that we're using for hosting the EU control plane. And at the same time, Cherry is also, we have an integration with them going live sometime within the next 45 days. And I'm really excited to be able to get that in front of our users because I think there's a lot of value in having, again, just more, number one is more providers in the Cycle ecosystem, but then number two is having European owned providers. There's, a whole data sovereignty concern that helps us solve too. Right.
Yes. Okay. Fantastic. What's next for Cycle? What are you kind of thinking about next? What are you kind of excited about for your future?
So next immediate in terms of like roadmap, number one is just being able to add more infrastructure providers. Cherry's is the start of that. We have a couple other companies that we're talking to add them. And then beyond that, we have, let's just say like a new monitoring system kind of going into Cycle. So that way companies have better observability over their servers, et cetera. And then on the horizon, one of the efforts that we're working on is being able to release Cycle for free for people with home labs. So anyone who has like a server that they want to, that they're not using for professional reasons, it's not part of a business, but they want to be able to, self-host, GitLab or I don't know, whatever they want to host, giving those people access to Cycle for free. And it's kind of the whole idea of like, hey, if Cycle is being built for all these organizations that are building really complex things, what will people use Cycle for? And even in just a home lab situation where they're just kind of throwing it on a server for testing and things like that. So, that's something that, we're hoping that through, those home lab efforts, we'll get Cycle in front of more developers, even if it's not, really for, I look at it as like an ecosystem growing effort.
So I want to sort of step up a level because we're getting towards the end of our time and just to sort of help us wrap it up a bit. So one thing that's kind of stood out to me a bit from this conversation is we've obviously focused quite a lot on the control plane itself, which is one of those things I'm not sure that I've really thought about that much in terms of the potential trust issues or risk that exists there. And I'm wondering if you think that that's a layer that has been kind of underappreciated in risk terms, maybe up till now.
Potentially. I think the important thing here is just kind of our definition of a control plane versus others. And what I mean by that is in some companies like Netlify, ECS, you are giving all of your trust to that company to maintain the control plane, the worker nodes, like all of the kind of things that make up that platform, right? And then on the other side, you have companies that are deploying Kubernetes from scratch and they're owning everything. There's not many companies in the ecosystem that are similar to Cycle where we are maintaining the control plane for our customers, meaning that our customers only have to worry about the worker nodes and like their storage. And so in our case, I think it's probably a little bit unique. At the same time, we also appreciate that companies want to know, like, what are the risks of using a control plane that might be distributed or geographically in an area that has different laws. So there's concerns and I guess yes, there are concerns and risks, but by us being able to deploy control planes in different geographic regions, my hope is that long term that mitigates many of those issues that could be foreseen there. And again, obviously, wrapping this up with a bow is going back to the point that our customers own all of their data, all of their infrastructure, et cetera. So the biggest risk of a control plane going down in Cycle's specific circumstance is like your infrastructure is still up and running, your containers are still up and running, your VMs are still up and running, like nothing is going to stop because again, traffic is routed into your server. So it's never routed in through the control plane. It just means that like absolute worst case scenario is that you wouldn't be able to use Cycle's API to perform actions against your infrastructure. So in terms of that being, the absolute worst case, I would say that's a pretty good worst case situation to have because at the same time, like your servers will still continue to maintain state, right? So like if our control plane were, again, I'm talking about worst case, but if our control plane were to go down, your servers will continue to maintain a manifest. So like if one of your containers crashes, but that manifest says, hey, like this container should be running, your server will still restart that container, even though it can't talk back to Cycle. So if we think of the control plane like as a state engine, but where it's like based off on an eventual consistency model, further de-risks a lot of the kind of situation that you might have there.
Right. Nice. And then maybe to finish it up, how do you see the sort of broader picture in terms of where our industry might be going? Do you think we're heading towards a kind of more fragmented internet, more fragmented infrastructure that's being increasingly shaped by geopolitics? Or do you think that this kind of tension we have between mainly Europe and the US, but also the West and China, do you see that eventually kind of resolving?
My opinion is that we will continue to see, I don't know if I want to use the word fragmentation. I think that we will see more regions kind of stepping up to the plate, and more regions stepping up to the plate and like building their own quote unquote AWS or their own GCP. And I know that the EU is putting a bunch of funding right now towards building the European version of AWS, right? And there's a number of providers that are part of that mission to try to get there. So I mean, I don't think I'd say fragmented, because at least I'm hoping that we don't have multiple internets where you need to specifically when you connect, you need to talk about which internet you're going to connect to. I think that'd be a terrible situation. I mean, I guess in theory it's possible someday that's where we end up. I'm hopeful that is not the case, but I do think that we will see more and more conversations on sovereignty, privacy. Like, I mean, even in the US, like I know that, this conversation might initially come across as anti-US, but I'm not, implying that at all, because, as a US citizen, as a number of people that I know back in the US, there's a lot of privacy concerns even in the US right now. And so you have a lot of people starting to, think about encryption and, how do we do some of these things differently that, is protecting workloads and communication and things like that more. So my hope is that, technology kind of keeps outpacing some of the, quote unquote bad actors. But I do think that at least in the short term, we will see more organizations focus on like, how do we have this within our boundaries? And I think regardless of any geopolitical things, I think it's probably a good effort. Too many people kind of handed over the keys to AWS and said, great, solve it all. And now AWS is sitting there holding your keys saying, now you need to pay me more if you want these keys back. And I think that there's a lot of conversations that are really starting around it. And so I'm excited to see kind of what happens over the next few years.
That's really exciting. Jake, thank you so much. It's been wonderful to talk to you. And thank you so much for joining me for this episode of the State of the Art for GOTO Unscripted.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Charles.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the GOTO podcast. Head over to gotopia.tech to discover lots more content from the brightest minds in software development.